Pablo Escobar hid billions of dollars. Most of it has never been found. That is the confirmed starting point. And I want to explain exactly how that happened, why it was possible, and what investigators actually know today. Let me start with the basics. Escobar was not born into power. He had no inheritance, no connections, no education that set him apart. What he had was a complete willingness to do things other people would not do. That is the only real explanation for how he started. As a teenager in the late 1960s, he stole tombstones from cemeteries around Antioquia. He sandblasted the names off. Then, he resold them to grieving families who had no idea where the stones came from. I find that detail important, not because it is dramatic, but because it shows something precise about how he thought. He saw an opportunity where nobody else was looking, and he felt nothing about the harm he caused. That combination, cold calculation with zero emotional break, is what criminologists later pointed to when they tried to explain what made him different. From there, the crimes got bigger in a very clear pattern. Car theft came after the tombstones. Extortion came after that. Kidnapping came after that. By 1971, he had already abducted a businessman named Diego Echevarria, collected the ransom, and then killed him anyway. That killing sent a message to everyone paying attention in Colombia's criminal world. This was someone who collected and then eliminated. There was no good faith deal to be made with him. What changed everything was cocaine, not because Escobar invented the drug trade, but because he recognized the scale of what it could become at a moment when almost no one else did. By 1976, the trade routes were still forming. The American appetite for cocaine was exploding. The supply system to feed it was disorganized. Escobar saw all of that with what I can only describe as startling clarity for a man with his background. That year, he was arrested carrying 39 kilograms of cocaine hidden inside a vehicle tire near Medellin. That arrest should have ended everything for him. Instead, it became a lesson. He bribed his way out. The officers who arrested him were later killed, and from that point forward, he operated on a single rule: plata o plomo, silver or lead, the bribe or the bullet. There was no third option. What made that rule so powerful was not just the threat behind it. It was how consistently he applied it. Judges, politicians, police commanders, military officers, none were exempt. Researchers who have studied Escobar's relationship with Colombia's institutions describe his corruption as systemic rather than opportunistic. He was not simply buying individual favors when he needed them. He was purchasing institutional loyalty, converting the machinery of the Colombian state into a protection system for his own operation. That is a meaningful distinction. In April 1978, Escobar attended a gathering with other mid-level traffickers on a rural farm outside Medellin. Colombian law enforcement historians now consider that meeting the formal birth of the Medellin cartel. Within months, the combined operation was moving approximately 19,000 kilograms of cocaine into the United States annually. Within a few years, that number became almost impossible to process. Here is the figure I think most people hear and still do not fully absorb. At the height of his operation, the Medellin cartel was generating an estimated $420 million per week. Not per year, per week. His personal fortune, estimated by Colombian and American law enforcement agencies, ranged between $30 billion and $60 billion. In today's currency, that is roughly $80 billion. In 1987, Forbes placed him on its billionaires list at an estimated $3 billion, and analysts later concluded that figure almost certainly undercounted what he actually controlled. He remained on that list for 7 consecutive years. The cartel was responsible for supplying approximately 80% of the world's cocaine at its peak. More than 15 tons entered the United States every single day, moving through a logistics network that included fleets of aircraft, cargo ships, and purpose-built submarines constructed in jungle workshops capable of crossing the Atlantic with multi-ton shipments. The DEA later concluded that Escobar's transportation infrastructure rivaled the operational complexity of a mid-sized international freight company. To me, the detail that best illustrates how extreme the money flow actually was is this. His brother Roberto, who served as the cartel's chief accountant, later testified that the organization spent approximately $2,500 per month on rubber bands alone, just to bundle the incoming cash. And Roberto estimated that nearly 10% of all stored currency, over $2 billion annually, was lost to rats, mold, flooding, and physical decay in the warehouses and underground vaults where it was being kept. In one confirmed incident, during a period when Escobar was in hiding, he burned approximately $2 million in banknotes through a single night to keep his daughter warm from the cold. That detail appears in multiple independent accounts. It was confirmed by family members after his death. The money had become, in the most literal sense, disposable. Now here is where the concealment part becomes important to understand properly. The practical problem Escobar faced was one that no bank could solve. Cash was arriving faster than it could be laundered. Banks could not absorb it at that speed. Businesses could not process it. Keeping it visible made it a target from rivals, from authorities, and from informants. His solution was physical. He built places to hide it. Across Antioquia and beyond, Escobar invested in concealment on a scale that law enforcement spent decades trying to map. Cartel safe houses were converted into fortified vaults. Walls were hollowed out and packed floor to ceiling with currency. Farms throughout the region concealed sealed barrels, buried several meters underground, packed with wrapped bundles of US dollars that would sit untouched for years. The properties were deliberately unremarkable from the outside. Neighbors often had no idea what was beneath the ground they were walking on. The vaults themselves were engineered with real precision. Steel doors, concrete walls of exceptional thickness, chambers lined with lead sheeting, specifically to defeat the ground-penetrating radar systems that existed at the time. Access points were disguised as storage rooms or utility spaces. Multiple independent construction teams were used for each project, each working only on their own section, so that no single contractor ever had a complete picture of what had been built. What made the system especially hard to penetrate was not just the physical engineering, it was the human structure around it. Escobar trusted almost no one with complete information. His accountants knew financial flows, but not physical locations. His construction crews built the chambers, but did not know what would go inside them. Only an inner circle of fewer than a dozen people, mostly family, ever held the full picture of where the money actually was. Roberto Escobar later described a system of coded ledgers, separate from any traceable documentation, in which vault locations were recorded in a private notation system that only Pablo fully understood. When Escobar died in December 1993, most of those codes died with him. That is confirmed. That is not speculation. The Miami property on North Bay Road in Miami Beach is a useful specific example. U.S. authorities seized it in the mid-1980s, and investigators were convinced its walls concealed hidden safes. In 2016, when new owners demolished the property, construction workers discovered exactly that. Heavy concrete safes embedded in the foundation. One safe disappeared before forensic teams could examine it, which prompted an investigation that was never conclusively resolved. A second was transported under armed guard to a Florida bank. A sealed metal cylinder found beneath the kitchen stove was empty, though investigators could not confirm whether it had always been empty or whether its contents had been removed before demolition began. Now, let me explain how the hunt to catch him actually worked, because that part contains information most people do not know. By the late 1980s, Escobar had ordered the assassination of Colombia's justice minister. He had taken down a presidential candidate at a public rally in 1989. He had ordered the bombing of Avianca Flight 203 in a failed attempt to kill that candidate's successor, Cesar Gaviria. The plane went down with 107 people aboard, including 2 American citizens. Those deaths brought Washington directly into the conflict. In 1989, President George H.W. Bush authorized Operation Heavy Shadow, a covert U.S. initiative to assist Colombia in dismantling the Medellin cartel. As part of that operation, the U.S. Army deployed Centra Spike, an elite signals intelligence unit specializing in intercepting communications and triangulating the locations of high-value targets. The unit had been used previously in Peru and Bolivia. Its deployment in Colombia was classified for years. Centra Spike began intercepting Escobar's phone calls almost immediately, building a comprehensive acoustic profile that allowed analysts to recognize his voice, his communication patterns, and the behavioral rhythms that would eventually give away his location. By the time Escobar negotiated his controversial surrender in 1991, the Americans had already been listening to him for nearly 2 years. The surrender itself was calculated. He negotiated a deal with the Colombian government to serve a maximum of 5 years in exchange for not being extradited to the United States. Rather than entering a state-controlled prison, he was permitted to construct his own facility, known as La Catedral, on a mountaintop overlooking Medellin. He selected his own guards from men personally loyal to him. The compound was equipped with a football pitch, a bar, a jacuzzi, a waterfall, and private dining facilities. According to both Colombian and American intelligence officials, it also had a telescope pointed at the city below. La Catedral was less a prison than a command center with theatrical fencing around it. Escobar continued running cartel operations from inside. In July 1992, when the Colombian government finally moved to transfer him to a legitimate facility after reports that he had ordered the torture and execution of 4 associates inside the compound, he was already gone. He had escaped through a section of wall that had been intentionally built with weakened concrete. By the time troops entered the building, Escobar had disappeared into the Andean fog with 9 of his men. What followed was one of the most resourced manhunts in the history of narcotics enforcement. Colonel Hugo Martinez had been pursuing Escobar since the late 1980s. He had survived assassination attempts. He had found bombs planted under his family's home. He had been personally offered a $6 million bribe through a mutual acquaintance, a bribe he refused without negotiation. When he returned to lead the operation after Escobar's escape, he restructured the search into a 600-man force with American Signals intelligence support from Centra Spike, Delta Force advisors operating under civilian cover, and real-time intercept data the Colombian units had never had access to before. A group called Los Pepes, meaning people persecuted by Pablo Escobar, emerged during this period as an extrajudicial pressure force. Their membership included former cartel allies who had watched Escobar destroy his own network. They bombed his properties, killed his associates, and eliminated the sense of invulnerability that had always been central to his psychological control. DEA agent Javier Peña later acknowledged in interviews that Los Pepes campaign was arguably the single most effective pressure applied against Escobar during the entire hunt. They destroyed his infrastructure faster than it could be rebuilt. A woman identified in DEA records as informant, AE 92053, was a critical human intelligence asset during the final months. She was the wife of one of the cartel partners Escobar had executed in 1992 during an internal dispute over money. Her intelligence on Escobar's finances, properties, and inner circle was described by DEA analysts as among the most operationally valuable human intelligence the agency received during the entire operation. Her younger brother, a student at MIT with no connection to the cartel, had been kidnapped and killed in retaliation for her cooperation. After that, her determination to see Escobar destroyed was, in the words of one official who worked with her, total and absolute. From inside a U.S. federal prison, Carlos later, once Escobar's partner in Bahamas-based cocaine smuggling operations, wrote a detailed letter to the DEA describing Escobar's current movements, his reliance on rotating safe houses, his use of cell phones in brief irregular bursts, and one physical detail that intelligence operatives found immediately useful. Escobar was significantly overweight and physically unfit. He could not move quickly over any distance. That information, confirmed through other channels, narrowed the type of property and terrain the search needed to focus on. On December 2nd, 1993, one day after his 44th birthday, Escobar made the call that ended everything. He phoned his son, Juan Pablo, for an extended conversation and stayed on the line far longer than any operational security should have allowed. Centra Spike intercepted the call. Within hours, triangulation had narrowed his location to a residential street in the Los Olivos neighborhood of Medellin, a middle-class district, completely ordinary. So ordinary that the simplicity of where he had been hiding almost defied what investigators had expected. Martinez's men moved on the address. Inside a modest two-story row house, Escobar and one bodyguard were waiting. The assault lasted less than 3 minutes. 3 rounds struck Escobar, one in the leg, one in the back, one through the right ear. He was found motionless on the roof tiles minutes later. The question of who fired the fatal shot was never conclusively answered. That is confirmed. Search Block Officer Hugo Aguilar claimed responsibility. A Los Pepes connected figure claimed it was his brother. Some argued a U.S. operator fired it, a claim that Centra Spike veterans have consistently denied, while acknowledging they cannot account for every individual present in the final minutes. A forensic re-examination in 2020 using ballistic gel reconstructions and updated wound analysis supported a theory advanced by journalist Mark Bowden, author of the definitive account of the manhunt. The fatal headshot showed wound characteristics inconsistent with a shot fired from any real distance. The barrel may have been pressed directly against his skull. Whether that was done by a Colombian officer, a Los Pepes operative, or Escobar himself has never been formally established. The official coroner's report denied suicide. What I find notable is that the denial was issued unprompted in a press release before the question had been publicly raised. Several forensic pathologists at the time noted that kind of clarification tends to produce more doubt than it resolves. After his death, Colombia attempted to account for the billions that had moved through the cartel. The results were, to me, genuinely striking. Colombian authorities have officially recovered approximately $75 million in Escobar-connected assets. Investigators widely believe that represents less than 10% of what was actually hidden. In 1989, photographs published by Colombian newspapers documented $4 million recovered from buried barrels in Antioquia. In 1990, $25 million was recovered alongside gold bars from a cartel warehouse. In 2009, $10 million was found during renovation work at Hacienda Nápoles, where workers broke through a concrete floor and discovered a sealed chamber that had sat undisturbed for nearly 2 decades. In 2020, Escobar's nephew, Nicolas Escobar Henao, claimed to have recovered $18 million from a house in Medellin. He described bundles of cash wrapped in plastic alongside a gold pen, a manual typewriter, and a satellite phone. Most of the currency had been destroyed by moisture and fungal growth. He acknowledged the find was not the first he had made and declined to say where any of the others were. In 2017, a documented investigation using ground-penetrating radar, drones, and metal detection equipment explored multiple sites across Antioquia. Investigators found lead-lined safes, false floors, and vaulted chambers specifically designed to be invisible to the scanning technology of the era. One safe was located and turned out to be empty. The billions were not found. In Antioquia, a farmer uncovered sealed drums of U.S. currency so well preserved that investigators described the bills as looking freshly printed. The legal question of who owned that find, the farmer, the Colombian state, or the victims of cartel violence, was never fully resolved, and opened a policy debate that continues in modified form today. The most consistent conclusion drawn by forensic accountants, law enforcement researchers, and independent investigators who have spent decades on this is straightforward. Most of the money is probably still out there, buried in fields, sealed behind concrete in properties that have changed hands multiple times, sitting in vaults beneath land that no one has yet thought to examine. The rats and the mold are still working in some places. In others, the money may still be in usable condition. When Colombian authorities raided Hacienda Nápoles and the connected safe house network in the early 1990s, they found what they expected: stacks of currency, sealed containers, physical evidence of a cash-based operation running at industrial scale. What they did not fully expect was the documentation. Hidden in waterproof containers throughout the vaults were handwritten ledgers, meticulous records of shipment schedules, payment rosters, and financial transactions stretching from Colombia to Miami to Madrid. Lists of bribes organized by recipient, amount, and date. Names of politicians, judges, police commanders, and military officers on the cartel's payroll, organized not by any moral category, but by operational usefulness, the way a business would organize its vendors. For prosecutors in both Colombia and the United States, those records were extraordinary. They confirmed in Escobar's own documentation what investigators had suspected but struggled to legally establish. The corruption was not a side effect of the cartel's operation. It was the operation. Former associates and residents of cartel-connected properties also described rooms that never appeared in official documentation. Soundproofed spaces with drainage systems and metal hooks that had no legitimate architectural purpose. Colombian law enforcement historians have treated those accounts as credible, based on the consistency of descriptions collected independently over many years, even though formal confirmation was never established. So let me tell you what I think the clearest conclusion is. After looking at all of this carefully, Escobar built two separate things. The first was an empire of money and violence that is well documented. The second was an empire of concealment around the first one, designed specifically to outlast him. And on that second point, he largely succeeded. The empire of violence ended on a Medellin rooftop in December 1993. Colombia celebrated. The United States acknowledged the effectiveness of its covert role, but the Medellin cartel's collapse created space that was filled almost immediately by the Cali cartel. Already organized, already operational, already waiting. Colombia's cocaine export capacity barely faltered. The violence that had been Escobar's instrument simply became the instrument of whoever came next. What I understand now, after going through all of this, is that Escobar is often treated as a singular phenomenon, when the more important truth is that he was a product and an accelerant of a system. He made it worse. He made it more violent, more powerful, and more deeply embedded in Colombia's institutions than it had ever been. But he did not create the conditions, and his death did not eliminate them. What ended on that rooftop was one man's extraordinary grip on a machine that kept running without him. The hidden money is a real thing. The vaults are real. The ledgers are real. The fact that billions of dollars remain unaccounted for is confirmed by every serious investigation into this topic. To me, the vaults matter not just because of what they contain financially. They matter because they are physical proof of how a man turns corruption into infrastructure. And that infrastructure, not the man himself, is what investigators are still working to fully understand. So that is how I understand it now. The money built the vaults. The vaults protected the money. And when the man was gone, the vaults kept his secrets better than any person ever could have.